In the vast expanse of Siberia, where the Ob River winds through endless wilderness, lies a small island that witnessed one of humanity's most horrific forgotten tragedies. An island where desperation drove human beings to the unthinkable. An island where Stalin's Soviet regime abandoned thousands of innocent people to die in the most brutal circumstances imaginable. This is the story of Nazino Island, a place that would become known as Cannibal Island. Welcome to Forgotten Horrors. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most disturbing chapters of Soviet history. A story so horrific that it was buried in classified documents for decades. If you're fascinated by the dark corners of human history and want to uncover more forgotten tragedies like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These stories need to be remembered, and your support helps ensure they're never forgotten again. But before we begin this harrowing journey, I must warn you, what you're about to hear contains descriptions of extreme human suffering, starvation, and cannibalism. This is not entertainment. This is history in its rawest, most unforgiving form. If you're not prepared for such content, now would be the time to step away. For those who remain, let us travel back to the spring of 1933 to understand how thousands of innocent souls came to be abandoned on a remote Siberian island where humanity itself would be put to the ultimate test. The year was 1933, and Stalin's Soviet Union was in the grip of rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization. But beneath the propaganda of progress lurked a sinister campaign of social engineering that would consume millions of lives. The Communist Party had declared war on what they called undesirable elements, deliberately vague term that could encompass almost anyone who didn't fit into their vision of the perfect socialist society. In the cramped offices of the OGPU, the secret police that would later become the KGB, bureaucrats worked tirelessly to fulfill quotas. Not quotas for grain or steel, but quotas for human lives. They had been tasked with cleansing Soviet cities of vagrants, criminals, and anyone deemed socially dangerous. The operation was called Cleansing or Ochistka, and it was about to unleash a nightmare beyond imagination. The arrests began in the early hours of May 1933. In Moscow, Leningrad, and dozens of other cities across the Soviet Union, OGPU agents swept through the streets like a plague. They targeted the homeless, the unemployed, petty criminals, and anyone who couldn't produce proper documentation. But as the operation expanded, the net grew wider and more indiscriminate. Witnesses later described scenes of utter chaos. Families were torn apart as breadwinners were dragged from their homes for the crime of being temporarily unemployed. Students were arrested for not having the right papers. Even Communist Party members found themselves caught in the machinery of deportation if they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. One survivor, Maria Yakovna Tretyakova, would later describe her arrest. "I was walking to the market when two men in leather coats stopped me. They demanded my papers. When I showed them my work permit, one of them said it was expired, though it wasn't. Before I could protest, I was pushed into a truck with dozens of other people. I never saw my home again." The arrested were herded into overcrowded transit camps and prisons. Moscow's Butyrka prison, designed to hold a few hundred inmates, was packed with over 3,000 people. The conditions were medieval. Men, women, and children were crammed together in cells with no sanitation, barely any food, and no information about their fate. For weeks, they waited. Rumors spread like wildfire through the packed cells. Some said they were being sent to work camps in the north. Others whispered that they would be executed. The truth, as it turned out, would be far worse than most could imagine. The plan, conceived in the sterile offices of the Soviet bureaucracy, was breathtaking in its callous simplicity. The arrested undesirable elements would be transported to remote locations in Siberia and simply left there. No infrastructure, no housing, no supplies. They were to build new settlements from nothing, transforming the wilderness into productive Soviet territory through sheer force of will or die trying. Genrik Yagoda, head of the OGPU, personally oversaw the operation. To him and his colleagues, these were not individual human beings with families, hopes, and dreams. They were numbers on a report, statistics to be moved from one column to another. The human cost was irrelevant, as long as the quotas were met and the cities were cleansed. The deportees were loaded onto freight trains in conditions that defied description. Cattle cars designed for livestock were packed with human beings, sometimes over 100 people per car. There were no toilets, no proper ventilation, and minimal food. The journey to Siberia would take over a week. As the trains rolled north through the Russian countryside, death began to take its toll. The elderly succumbed first, then the sick and the very young. Bodies were stacked in corners of the cars, and when the trains made rare stops, guards would simply throw the corpses into ditches beside the tracks. Nina Ivanovna Zubova, who was 13 years old at the time, later recalled, "My grandfather died on the second day. We kept his body with us because my grandmother couldn't bear to let him go." By the time we reached Tomsk, she was talking to his corpse as if he were still alive. The smell was terrible, but we had nowhere to go. The train journey was just the beginning of the nightmare. As the freight cars rolled deeper into Siberia, the deportees had no idea that their destination would become synonymous with humanity's capacity for both evil and survival. They were heading toward a place that would test every boundary of human endurance and morality. On May 18, 1933, the first train arrived at the railway station of Tomsk, a remote city in western Siberia. The deportees, after more than a week packed in cattle cars, stumbled out onto the platform, those who were still able to walk. Many had already died during the journey, and their bodies were unceremoniously dumped beside the tracks. What greeted the survivors was a scene from a nightmare. Local officials were completely unprepared for the massive influx of people. No one had arranged for housing, food, or basic sanitation. The deportees were simply herded into a muddy field outside the station and left to fend for themselves. Over the following days, more trains arrived, then more. Soon, nearly 6,000 human beings were crowded into a makeshift camp with no shelter, no clean water, and virtually no food. The spring weather was cold and wet, and many people had only the clothes they wore when arrested weeks earlier. Commandant Vladimir Tsepkov, the local OGPU official put in charge of the operation, was in over his head. His orders were simple but impossible. Transport the deportees to uninhabited areas, where they would establish new settlements. The problem was that no preparations had been made. There were no supplies, no tools, no housing materials, nothing. In desperation, Tsepkov decided to transport the deportees by barge down the Ob River to Nazino Island, a remote, marshy piece of land about 3 kilometers long and 600 meters wide. The island was uninhabited for good reason. It was little more than a swamp covered in scrub brush, with no fresh water source and no shelter from the elements. The journey down the Ob River was another chapter of horror. The deportees were loaded onto barges designed for cargo, not people. They were packed so tightly that many couldn't sit down. There were no toilets, no food distribution system, and no medical care. People defecated where they stood, adding to the stench and disease. Even Gladyshev, a barge worker who witnessed the transport, later testified, "I've transported cattle in better conditions. These people were packed like sardines, standing in their own filth. Many were already dying. I saw mothers holding dead babies, refusing to let them go. It was inhuman." On May 27, 1933, the barges reached Nazino Island. What happened next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The guards forced the deportees off the barges at gunpoint, pushing them onto the muddy shore of the island. Then, incredibly, the barges simply left. Nearly 5,000 human beings were abandoned on a remote island with nothing No food, no tools, no shelter, no way to escape. The reality of their situation hit them like a physical blow. They were stranded on a marshy island in the middle of a Siberian river, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest town. The guards had left them with a promise that food would be delivered soon. But as the hours passed, then days, it became clear that they had been abandoned to die. Alexei Nikolaevich Veliko, one of the few survivors, later described the first night. People were crying, praying, cursing. Some went mad immediately. Others just sat in the mud and stared at the water. The island was mostly swamp, and there was nowhere to take shelter. We had no axes to cut down trees, no tools to build anything. We were like animals, but even animals would have been treated better. The weather turned cold and rainy. Without shelter or dry clothes, hypothermia began claiming lives within hours. The weakest, the elderly, the sick, and small children died first. But they were just the beginning. As night fell over Nazino Island on that first day, nearly 5,000 human beings lay down on the cold, wet ground with no idea if they would live to see another sunrise. They had been reduced to their most basic instincts in a matter of hours. The thin veneer of civilization that separates human beings from wild animals had been stripped away by the Soviet state's callous indifference. What would happen over the next few days would push the boundaries of human survival and morality beyond anything previously recorded in history. The second day on Nazino Island dawned gray and cold. The deportees woke those who had managed to sleep at all to find dozens of bodies around them. Death had stalked through their ranks during the night, claiming victims with ruthless efficiency. With no tools or materials, the living faced impossible choices. Some tried to bury the dead using their bare hands, but the ground was too hard and rocky. Others simply moved away from the corpses, leaving them where they lay. Soon, bodies were scattered across the island like grotesque landmarks. The lack of food became critical within 24 hours. The guards had promised that supplies would be delivered, but no boats appeared on the horizon. Hunger, that most primal of human drives, began to consume rational thought. People scoured the island desperately for anything edible: grass, roots, bark from trees. Some caught small fish with their bare hands in the shallow water near shore, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Dr. Nadezhda Anatolievna Grigorieva, a physician who had been arrested for suspicious associations, tried to organize the deportees and establish some semblance of order. But her efforts were quickly overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. "I had no medical supplies, no instruments, nothing," she would later testify. People were dying of exposure, dehydration, and starvation. But worse than that, I could see madness creeping into their eyes. Civilized people were becoming animals before my very eyes. On the third day, the unthinkable happened. The first case of cannibalism was reported. It started with Maria Kostina, a mother from Moscow who had been arrested for vagrancy. Her 2-year-old daughter had died during the second night, and Maria had cradled the tiny body for hours, refusing to let anyone take it away. When other deportees woke on the third morning, they found Maria sitting by the river, methodically eating strips of flesh she had cut from her own child's corpse with a sharp stone. The sight sent shockwaves through the camp. Some people vomited, others screamed, but a few, driven beyond the edge of sanity by hunger and despair, watched with a different kind of horror. The horror of recognition. They understood, with terrible clarity, that they too might soon face the same impossible choice. Word spread across the island like wildfire. Within hours, groups began forming not for mutual aid, but for protection. People realized that the dead were becoming sources of food, and the living were potential prey. The island quickly divided into territories controlled by different groups. The strongest men formed gangs that claimed the best areas, patches of dry ground, or spots with some natural windbreak. The weak, the old, and the sick were pushed to the edges, toward the marshy areas where standing water bred disease and offered no protection from the elements. Violence erupted as competition for resources intensified. Fights broke out over scraps of clothing, over access to the cleaner water near shore, over the right to sleep in slightly drier spots. But most horrifically, fights began breaking out over the bodies of the dead. By the fourth day, organized cannibalism had begun. The strongest groups started actively hunting the weakest members of the community. They would identify people who were close to death and simply wait for them to die, or sometimes, as witnesses later testified, help them along. Dmitry Mikhailovich Strelnikov, a former accountant, kept a diary on scraps of paper throughout the ordeal. His entries from this period are almost impossible to read. Day 4. Fedorov died in the night. Kuzmin's group took the body before dawn. They don't even try to hide it anymore. Boiled the flesh in a pot they made from a piece of metal. The smell. God help us all. Day 5. Anna Petrovna went mad. She's been eating pieces of her husband since yesterday. Her children are dead too, but she won't let anyone near them. I think she's saving them. Day 6. The Volkov brothers have set up what they call the kitchen. They're killing people now, not waiting for them to die. I saw them take the sick boy, Pavel. He was still breathing when they... I can't write this. I can't. The island had become a medieval nightmare. Groups of cannibals roamed freely, selecting victims based on weakness and vulnerability. They developed crude but effective methods of butchering human flesh. Some even began to differentiate between different types of meat, preferring the flesh of younger victims. The psychological transformation was as horrifying as the physical reality. People who had been teachers, clerks, and parents just days earlier were now calculating predators, evaluating fellow human beings as potential meals. But even more disturbing were the gradations of horror that developed. Some cannibals only ate those who had died naturally. Others actively killed to obtain fresh meat. A few developed what could only be described as a taste for human flesh, continuing to hunt even when other food became available. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their smaller size made them easy targets, and their meat was considered more tender. Parents who had survived the journey now faced the ultimate nightmare, watching their children become prey for organized cannibals. Yet amidst this descent into barbarism, some remarkable acts of humanity continued. Small groups banded together to protect the most vulnerable. They shared the few edible plants they could find and took turns staying awake to guard against the cannibal gangs. Dr. Grigorieva managed to save several children by hiding them in a small depression near the shore and covering them with reeds. She would later say that protecting those children was the only thing that kept her sane during those terrible days. As the first week on Nazino Island drew to a close, nearly 1,500 people had died. But for the survivors, the worst was yet to come. By the end of the first week, Nazino Island had developed its own twisted economy, an economy based on human flesh. What had begun as desperate acts of survival by individuals had evolved into an organized system of predation that divided the island's inhabitants into distinct castes: the hunters, the hunted, and those trying desperately to remain invisible. The strongest and most ruthless men formed what could only be described as cannibal gangs. These groups, typically consisting of 5 to 10 members, established territories across the island and developed sophisticated hunting strategies. They had learned to identify the weak, the sick, and they isolated those who would make easy targets. Andrei Volkov, a former prison guard who had been arrested in the sweep, emerged as one of the most feared leaders. His crew, as survivors later called it, controlled the driest section of the island and had established what they euphemistically called the butcher shop, a clearing where they processed their victims. The Volkov gang had developed a systematic approach to murder and cannibalism. They would identify targets, usually people who were already sick or injured, and watch them carefully. When a victim was isolated or appeared close to death, they would strike quickly and efficiently. Valentina Ivanovna Sergeeva, one of the survivors, witnessed one of these attacks. They came for old Mikhail Petrov in the morning. He had been sick for days, could barely walk. 3 of them surrounded him while he was trying to drink from the river. They didn't even speak to him. One hit him with a piece of wood, and when he fell, they dragged him away while he was still breathing. We could hear him screaming from their camp, but the cannibals didn't limit themselves to the dying. As the days passed and hunger continued to gnaw at their sanity, they became increasingly bold. They began targeting healthy people, particularly women and children who couldn't fight back effectively. The psychological dynamics on the island became increasingly complex. Some people, driven by desperation, willingly joined the cannibal gangs, seeing it as their only chance for survival. Others formed alliances with the cannibals, trading information about weak or isolated individuals in exchange for protection or scraps of food. Maria Stepanovna Kazakova later testified about the moral compromises people made. There was a group of women who would identify targets for the Volkov gang. They would befriend sick people, gain their trust, and then signal to the cannibals when those people were alone. In exchange, they received small pieces of meat and protection from being hunted themselves. They weren't cannibals, but they were accomplices to murder. The island's geography played a crucial role in this nightmare. The marshy terrain meant there were only a few areas of relatively dry ground where people could rest without sinking into the mud. These prime spots were controlled by the strongest gangs, while the weak were forced into the wetlands where disease and hypothermia killed as efficiently as human predators. Dr. Grigorieva, still trying to provide what medical care she could, documented the rapid spread of disease across the island. Without sanitation, clean water, or proper waste disposal, dysentery, typhus, and other infections spread like wildfire. But even disease became part of the island's deadly economy. The cannibals preferred victims who had died of disease, she later wrote. They believed that people who died of starvation had less meat on them, while those who succumbed to illness were still relatively well nourished. It was a grotesque calculation, but they had become very practical about their hunting. The psychological toll on both perpetrators and witnesses was devastating. Many people simply retreated into madness as a defense mechanism. They would sit motionless for hours, staring at the water or talking to invisible companions. Some became catatonic, while others developed violent psychosis. Even Yurovich Petrov, a former teacher, described his own psychological breakdown. By the 10th day, I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I would see my dead students calling to me from the water. I would have conversations with my wife, who I knew was dead, but I could see her as clearly as I see you now. The only reality was hunger and the smell of cooking flesh that never went away. Children who survived developed coping mechanisms that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Some became eerily quiet and withdrawn, while others exhibited premature adult behaviors, learning to negotiate with cannibals for their own survival. Katya Morozova was only 8 years old when she was deported to the island. Her survival strategy was to make herself useful to the cannibal gangs by helping them identify weak victims. In exchange, they allowed her to eat scraps from their meals. She later said, "I knew it was wrong, but I wanted to live. I helped them kill people so they wouldn't kill me. I was 8 years old, and I became a monster." The island's economy of death had its own supply and demand dynamics. As the number of living people decreased, competition for victims intensified. This led to wars between different cannibal gangs as they fought for control of the remaining prey. Some groups began hoarding bodies, keeping them in crude cold storage by burying them in the mud or submerging them in the cold river water. Others developed techniques for preserving meat by smoking it over small fires built from driftwood and scrub brush. The most horrifying development was the emergence of what survivors called Livestock, living people who are kept alive but incapacitated, fed minimal amounts to keep them alive while their captors gradually consumed them. These victims would have their limbs broken to prevent escape, and pieces of flesh would be cut from their bodies while they were still alive. The cannibals had learned that fresh meat was preferable to meat from corpses, and they developed techniques for keeping their victims alive as long as possible while slowly consuming them. Anna Konstantinovna Varanova, one of the few people who witnessed this practice and survived, later testified. They kept 3 people in a pit they had dug near their camp. Every day, they would take one person out and cut meat from their arms or legs. They would cauterize the wounds with hot metal to stop the bleeding and keep the person alive. The screams went on for days. As the second week on Nazino Island drew to a close, the population had dropped from nearly 5,000 to fewer than 2,500. The island had become a laboratory of human evil, a place where the boundaries between civilization and barbarism had not just been crossed, but obliterated entirely. Yet even in this hell on earth, some people managed to maintain their humanity. Small groups continued to share resources, protect the vulnerable, and refuse to participate in the cannibalistic feeding frenzy. Their survival was a testament to the fact that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings retain the capacity for both good and evil. But their ordeal was far from over. As the horror on Nazino Island reached its peak, the outside world remained largely oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding in the remote Siberian wilderness. The Soviet bureaucratic machine had efficiently compartmentalized the deportation operation, ensuring that few officials knew the full scope of what was happening. However, reports had begun filtering back to regional authorities that something had gone terribly wrong with the special resettlement operation. Local officials in Tomsk were receiving disturbing accounts from river workers and occasional travelers who had glimpsed the island from a distance. Smoke from cooking fires, the smell of death, and disturbing sounds carried across the water had created rumors that even hardened Soviet bureaucrats found difficult to dismiss. The first official to investigate was Alexander Lerin, a mid-level party functionary who had been sent to assess the progress of the resettlement program. When he arrived at the embarkation point in Tomsk on June 8, 1933, he was told that the deportees had been successfully transported to their new settlement location. But when Lerin demanded to visit the site personally, local officials became evasive. Commandant Sepkov, who had overseen the original transport, claimed that the weather had been too dangerous for supply boats to reach the island. When pressed for details about the settlers' condition, he provided only vague assurances that they were adapting to their new environment. Growing suspicious, Lerin arranged for a boat to take him to Nazino Island. On June 20th, 1933, nearly a month after the deportees had been abandoned there, what he found defied every horror his imagination could have conjured. The island reeked of death. Bodies in various states of decomposition were scattered across the muddy ground. Some showed clear evidence of having been butchered for meat limbs removed, torsos carved up, skulls cracked open. The living survivors he encountered were barely recognizable as human beings. Lerin's official report, preserved in Soviet archives, provides a chilling bureaucratic account of the nightmare. The condition of the special resettlers is catastrophic. Approximately 2,000 individuals have died from starvation, exposure, and violence. The remaining population exhibits signs of severe malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma. Evidence of cannibalistic practices is widespread and undeniable. Immediate evacuation and medical intervention are required, but even Lerin's dry bureaucratic language couldn't capture the full horror of what he witnessed. In his private diary, later discovered by historians, he wrote more candidly, "This is not a resettlement. This is a death camp. I have seen battlefields in the Civil War, but nothing prepared me for this. People who have been reduced to animals, fighting over human flesh like wild dogs. A woman showed me her baby dead for days, and asked if I wanted to buy it for food. She wasn't mad. She was just trying to survive. The survivors Laren encountered told stories that challenged his understanding of human nature. They described the evolution of cannibalistic practices, the development of hunting techniques, and the complete breakdown of social norms. Some survivors had maintained their sanity and humanity, but others had been so traumatized that they could barely communicate. Dr. Grigorieva, still trying to care for the sick despite having no medical supplies, provided Laren with detailed accounts of the medical crisis on the island. Dysentery, typhus, and other diseases had spread unchecked. But more disturbing were her observations about the psychological state of the survivors. Many of them no longer remember their names, she told Laren. They speak only about food, who has it, where to find it, how to get it. Some of the cannibals have developed what I can only describe as a preference for human flesh. Even when other food is available, they seek out human meat. They have been fundamentally changed by this experience. Laren also interviewed several of the cannibal gang leaders, including Andrei Volkov. These conversations, recorded in his report, provide disturbing insights into how ordinary people can be transformed by extreme circumstances. Volkov showed no remorse for his actions. He explained his hunting strategies with the clinical detachment of a professional soldier discussing military tactics. When Laren asked how he could justify murdering innocent people, Volkov replied, "Innocent? We're all here because the state decided we were criminals. If they wanted us to act like civilized people, they should have treated us like human beings. They created this situation, not us." The logic was chilling, but not entirely without merit. The Soviet state had created the conditions that led directly to this catastrophe. The decision to deport thousands of people without adequate supplies or preparation had been a death sentence from the beginning. Acting on Laren's report, authorities finally authorized an evacuation of the island. But even this humanitarian gesture was bungled by bureaucratic incompetence and callous indifference. The first evacuation boat arrived on June 25, 1933, but it had space for only 200 people. The selection process for who would be rescued first created a new kind of horror. Families were separated, as only the strongest were deemed suitable for transport. Many parents were forced to choose which of their children would be saved. The evacuation process stretched over several days, and during that time, additional deaths occurred. Some people were too weak to survive the boat journey. Others died while waiting for rescue, their bodies joining the hundreds already scattered across the island. Marina Petrovna Sidorova, whose husband and 2 sons had died on the island, was among the first group evacuated. Her account of leaving captures the surreal horror of the situation. "When the boat came to take us away, I couldn't move at first. I had been on that island for over a month, and it had become my entire world. I knew where every body was located, which areas were safe, how to avoid the cannibals. It was hell, but it was familiar hell. The thought of leaving terrified me, almost as much as staying." The evacuated survivors were taken to a transit camp in Tomsk, where they received medical treatment and were interrogated by NKVD officers. The authorities were primarily concerned with gathering information about who had participated in cannibalism and other crimes. Many survivors were reluctant to provide details, fearing that they would be punished for their own actions or for failing to prevent others' crimes. The children who survived presented particular challenges for the authorities. Many were orphaned and had no relatives to claim them. Others had been so traumatized that they couldn't remember their real names or where they had come from. Some had been complicit in cannibalistic activities and struggled with overwhelming guilt and shame. Katya Morozova, the 8-year-old who had helped identify victims for the cannibals, was placed in a state orphanage where she remained largely silent for over a year. When she finally began speaking again, she would only communicate in whispers and refused to eat meat of any kind for the rest of her life. The final evacuation boat left Nazino Island on July 3, 1933, carrying the last 47 survivors. Of the nearly 5,000 people who had been abandoned on the island 5 weeks earlier, fewer than 300 were still alive. But the nightmare wasn't over for those who survived. They carried psychological scars that would never heal, and many found that the outside world was not prepared to deal with what they had experienced. The survivors of Nazino Island found that their ordeal was far from over once they reached the mainland. The Soviet authorities, faced with overwhelming evidence of a catastrophic failure in their deportation program, made a calculated decision. The Nazino tragedy would be buried, both literally and figuratively. The official response was swift and comprehensive. All survivors were required to sign documents swearing them to secrecy about their experiences. They were warned that discussing the events on Nazino Island would be considered spreading anti-Soviet propaganda and could result in lengthy prison sentences or execution. Dr. Nadezhda Grigorieva, who had tried to maintain medical care during the crisis, was arrested 3 days after her evacuation from the island. The charges against her were deliberately vague, failure to maintain public order, and negligence in medical duties. She was sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag, where she died in 1936. The message to other survivors was clear. Silence was the price of continued existence. Alexander Larin, the party official who had documented the horror, found his career destroyed despite his attempts to work within the system. His detailed reports were classified at the highest levels, and he was reassigned to an obscure bureaucratic position in the Ukrainian SSR. When he attempted to follow up on the fate of the survivors, he was warned that his obsession with past events was interfering with his duties to the state. The physical evidence of the tragedy was systematically eliminated. A special NKVD unit was dispatched to Nazino Island to dispose of the remaining bodies and destroy any traces of what had occurred. The hundreds of corpses scattered across the island were burned in massive pyres, and the ashes were scattered in the Ob River. Local officials who had been involved in the deportation operation were quietly transferred or demoted, but none faced serious consequences for their role in the catastrophe. Commandant Sepkov, who had been directly responsible for abandoning the deportees without supplies, was reassigned to a similar position in Kazakhstan, where he continued his career without interruption. The Soviet press, completely controlled by the state, made no mention of Nazino Island. Instead, they published glowing reports about the success of urban cleansing operations and the heroic efforts to settle previously uninhabitable regions of Siberia. But despite the official conspiracy of silence, word of the tragedy began to spread through underground networks of survivors, former prisoners, and their families. The story of Cannibal Island became part of the Soviet Union as shadow history, a collection of horrors whispered in private but never acknowledged publicly. The psychological impact on survivors proved more difficult to suppress than their voices. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though Soviet psychiatry of the era had no framework for understanding or treating such conditions. Even Gladyshev, the barge worker who had witnessed the transportation to the island, began drinking heavily and would often be found talking to himself about the floating cemetery he had helped create. His family later said he would wake up screaming about bodies in the water and refuse to work on the river again. Survivors who tried to return to normal life found themselves haunted by their experiences in ways that their contemporaries could not understand. Many suffered from chronic nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to form normal human relationships. Some developed eating disorders, either refusing to eat meat or, more disturbingly, developing compulsive eating behaviors. Maria Cristina, the mother who had been forced to cannibalize her own child to survive, was found dead in her apartment 6 months after her rescue. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but neighbors reported that she had been starving herself and speaking to invisible children. The survivors' children and grandchildren also bore the burden of the secret. Many survivors were reluctant to have children, fearing they might pass on their trauma or that similar tragedies could occur again. Those who did have families often struggled with how much to tell their children about their experiences. Some survivors developed elaborate cover stories about their past, claiming to have worked in remote mining operations or lumber camps during the period they had actually spent on Nazino Island. Others simply refused to discuss their past at all, creating families built on foundations of silence and unspoken trauma. The few survivors who attempted to document their experiences faced severe consequences. Dmitry Strelnikov, the accountant who had kept a diary during the ordeal, was arrested in 1937 when his hidden writings were discovered during a search of his apartment. He was charged with maintaining anti-Soviet materials and executed without trial. Yet despite the risks, some survivors felt compelled to preserve the memory of what had happened. They developed coded ways of communicating with other survivors, using euphemisms and indirect references that allowed them to share their experiences without explicitly violating their oaths of silence. A network of survivors gradually formed across the Soviet Union, connected by their shared trauma and their determination to ensure that the victims of Nazino Island would not be forgotten entirely. These informal networks operated carefully, meeting in small groups and sharing memories through coded language. They developed rituals to honor the dead, lighting candles on the anniversary of the deportation, visiting Orthodox churches to pray for the souls of the victims, and teaching their children about the importance of human dignity without revealing the specific details of their experiences. Valentina Sergeyeva, who had witnessed the organized cannibalism, became a central figure in one of these networks. She maintained contact with other survivors through letters that appeared to be routine family correspondence, but contained hidden messages about the continuing health and location of survivors. "We couldn't let them disappear completely," she later explained. "Every person who died on that island had been someone's child, someone's parent, someone's beloved. The state wanted to erase them, but we remembered their names. We remembered their faces. It was the only monument we could give them." The psychological toll of maintaining this secret for decades was enormous. Many survivors developed what family members described as two personalities: the public face they showed to the world and the private self that carried the burden of Nazino Island. This psychological splitting often led to severe depression and, in some cases, suicide. Elena Dmitrievna Kroglova, who had been 17 when deported to the island, managed to build what appeared to be a successful life after her rescue. She married, had 3 children, and worked as a librarian in Moscow. But her family later revealed that she had nightmares every single night for 47 years and kept a detailed diary of her memories from the island hidden in her apartment until her death. The official records of the Nazino tragedy remained buried in secret archives, classified at the highest levels of government. Occasionally, junior officials would stumble across references to the deportation operation in bureaucratic documents, but the full story remained hidden behind layers of state security. This official silence extended to academic and historical research. Soviet historians were forbidden from investigating the deportation campaigns of the 1930s, and any mention of mass deaths during this period was strictly censored. The official narrative focused on the heroic achievements of Soviet industrialization and collectivization, with no acknowledgement of the human cost. International awareness of Soviet atrocities during this period was limited by the closed nature of the Soviet system. While some information about collectivization and the Ukrainian famine reached the West, specific tragedies like Nazino Island remained completely unknown outside the Soviet Union. The few Western journalists and diplomats who managed to travel through Siberia in the 1930s saw only what Soviet authorities wanted them to see. The remote location of Nazino Island and the thorough elimination of physical evidence ensured that international scrutiny never focused on this particular horror. Even within the Soviet Union, knowledge of similar deportation tragedies was compartmentalized. Officials in Ukraine knew about local deportations, but nothing about Siberian operations. Siberian officials were aware of problems in their region, but had no comprehensive understanding of the scale of deportations nationwide. This fragmentation of information was deliberate policy, designed to prevent any single individual or group from understanding the full scope of Soviet population engineering projects. It also meant that each tragedy remained isolated, making it easier for authorities to suppress information and prevent the development of organized opposition. The survivors of Nazino Island found themselves uniquely isolated, even within the community of Soviet victims. Their experiences were more extreme than those of most Gulag prisoners, and the cannibalism that had occurred made their story particularly difficult to share even with sympathetic audiences. Many survivors reported feeling that their experiences were so horrific that they couldn't burden others with the knowledge. Some felt guilty about surviving when so many others had died. Others struggled with shame about actions they had taken or witnessed during their time on the island. Dr. Grigorieva's fate became symbolic of the state's approach to the survivors. As one of the few educated professionals who had witnessed the entire catastrophe, she represented both a valuable source of information and a dangerous threat to official narratives. Her imprisonment and death served as a warning to other survivors about the consequences of speaking out. The destruction of physical evidence was paralleled by bureaucratic measures to eliminate paper trails. Documents related to the deportation operation were systematically destroyed or reclassified at such high levels that even senior party officials couldn't access them. Orders were given verbally whenever possible, and written records were deliberately vague about specific locations and outcomes. This careful elimination of evidence would prove highly effective. For decades after Stalin's death, even reform-minded Soviet leaders had difficulty determining exactly what had happened during the deportation campaigns of the 1930s. The institutional knowledge had been deliberately destroyed, and the few survivors were either dead or too frightened to speak. As the years passed, the conspiracy of silence around Nazino Island became self-reinforcing. Younger generations of Soviet officials had no knowledge of the tragedy, making it easier to maintain the cover-up. The few remaining survivors became elderly and died off, taking their memories with them to their graves. By the 1960s, even the general location of Nazino Island had been forgotten by most officials. Maps were altered to obscure the island's significance, and it was left to return to its natural state as a remote, uninhabited piece of Siberian wilderness. But the story of Nazino Island could not remain buried forever. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 marked the beginning of a gradual thaw in the Soviet system. But the conspiracy of silence around Nazino Island proved remarkably durable. Even during Nikita Khrushchev's period of de-Stalinization in the late 1950s, when many Soviet crimes were acknowledged and victims rehabilitated, the Nazino tragedy remained hidden. The reasons for this continued secrecy were complex. Unlike other Stalin-era atrocities that could be blamed on the dictator's personal paranoia or the excesses of his immediate circle, the Nazino deportation represented a systemic failure that implicated the entire Soviet bureaucratic apparatus. Acknowledging the tragedy would have required admitting that thousands of innocent people had died not because of political persecution, but because of sheer administrative incompetence and callous indifference to human life. Moreover, the extreme nature of what had occurred on the island, particularly the cannibalism, made it difficult for Soviet leaders to address, without undermining the entire narrative of socialist progress and moral superiority. How could a system that claimed to represent the highest form of human civilization acknowledge that it had created conditions worse than anything in pre-revolutionary Russia? During the 1960s and 1970s, a few elderly survivors attempted to break their silence. They wrote letters to party officials, petitioned for recognition as victims of political repression, and tried to contact journalists and historians. But these efforts were systematically blocked by mid-level bureaucrats who either had orders to suppress such inquiries or were simply following ingrained habits of secrecy. Katya Morozova, who had survived as a child by helping cannibal gangs identify victims, made several attempts to have her experiences officially acknowledged. In 1967, she wrote a detailed letter to Leonid Brezhnev describing what had happened on Nazino Island and requesting that the victims be honored with a memorial. The response she received was typical of the bureaucratic stonewalling that survivors encountered. Your letter has been reviewed by the appropriate authorities. The events you describe cannot be verified through official records. We recommend that you focus on contributing to the building of communism rather than dwelling on unsubstantiated claims about the past. Similar form letters were sent to other survivors who attempted to break their silence. The message was clear. The official position was that Nazino Island had never happened, and anyone claiming otherwise would be dismissed as unreliable or mentally unstable. This gaslighting had a devastating effect on the remaining survivors. Many began to question their own memories, wondering if their trauma had distorted their recollections of events. Others retreated further into silence, convinced that their experiences would never be acknowledged or understood. The geographical isolation that had made Nazino Island such an effective killing ground now served to maintain its invisibility. Unlike the Katyn forest or the Kolyma gold mines, which were located near transportation routes and populated areas, Nazino Island remained genuinely remote. Few people had any reason to visit the area, and those who did were unlikely to recognize the significance of what appeared to be simply another unremarkable piece of Siberian wilderness. Local indigenous communities in the region had their own memories of the tragedy, passed down through oral traditions. Hunters and fishermen spoke of a cursed island where evil spirits dwelled, and they avoided the area during certain times of the year. But these indigenous voices were marginalized in Soviet society, and their stories were dismissed as superstition by outside observers. The cover-up was so effective that by the 1970s, some survivors began to wonder if they had been the victims of a deliberate extermination program rather than bureaucratic incompetence. The systematic destruction of evidence and the consistent denial of official records suggested a level of coordination that seemed to exceed mere administrative bungling. This uncertainty added another layer of trauma for survivors. Not only had they experienced unimaginable horror, but they were denied any official acknowledgement of their suffering or understanding of why it had occurred. They existed in a liminal space between memory and history, carrying experiences that the official world insisted had never happened. International awareness of Soviet deportation policies grew during the Cold War, particularly after the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago in the West. However, Solzhenitsyn's focus was primarily on the camp system and political prisoners. The special deportations of undesirable elements, like those sent to Nazino Island, received less attention, partly because fewer survivors had managed to emigrate and tell their stories. Western historians and journalists who investigated Soviet crimes focused primarily on well-documented atrocities like the Ukrainian famine or the Great Terror. The destruction of evidence surrounding Nazino Island meant that researchers had no paper trail to follow, and the few surviving witnesses were either dead or still living in fear within the Soviet Union. The island itself began to develop an eerie reputation among the few locals who knew of its history. River workers reported strange sounds coming from the island at night, screams and crying that seemed to have no source. Some claimed to see fires on the island when no one was supposed to be there. These reports were dismissed as folklore, but they reflected the psychological impact that the tragedy continued to have on the region. The island had become a symbol of unacknowledged trauma, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had been irreparably damaged. During the 1980s, as Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms began to open Soviet society, a few brave historians and journalists started investigating previously forbidden topics. Some stumbled across fragmentary references to the 1933 deportation operations in declassified documents, But the specific details of Nazino Island remained hidden. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1988, a young archivist named Svetlana Dolgoruki was conducting research on Soviet industrial development in Siberia when she discovered a misfiled document in the Tomsk Regional Archives. It was Alexander Larin's original report on the conditions he had found on Nazino Island, somehow overlooked during the systematic purging of related documents. Dolgoruki recognized immediately that she had found evidence of a major historical tragedy. But when she attempted to pursue the story through official channels, she encountered the same bureaucratic resistance that had silenced previous inquiries. Undeterred, Dolgoruki began a personal investigation that would span several years. She tracked down surviving family members of deportees, interviewed elderly river workers who remembered the transportation barges, and searched through multiple archives for any remaining documentation. Her research was dangerous work. Even during the Gorbachev era, investigating certain aspects of Soviet history could end careers or result in harassment by security services. Dolgoruki was warned by colleagues and supervisors to abandon her research, but she persisted. In 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, Dolgoruki finally succeeded in locating 3 surviving witnesses to the Nazino Island tragedy. 2 were former deportees who had managed to survive the ordeal, and 1 was a river worker who had participated in the evacuation. Their testimonies, combined with the documentary evidence she had uncovered, allowed Dolgoruki to reconstruct the basic facts of what had happened on the island nearly 60 years earlier. But even then, the full story remained difficult to piece together because so much evidence had been systematically destroyed. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 finally created the political space necessary for the Nazino Island story to emerge from the shadows. But by then, almost all of the survivors were dead, and much of the historical record had been permanently lost. The few remaining witnesses were elderly and traumatized, their memories fragmented by decades of enforced silence. They struggled to convey the full horror of their experiences to interviewers who had no frame of reference for understanding what they described. As the story of Nazino Island finally began to reach public attention in the 1990s, it faced a new kind of resistance, not from government censors, but from a society that was already overwhelmed by revelations about Soviet-era atrocities. The Russian public was learning about the Great Terror, the Ukrainian famine, and the massive scale of the Gulag system. In this context, even a tragedy as extreme as Nazino Island struggled to find an audience. The story also faced skepticism from some historians and journalists who found the accounts of organized cannibalism too extreme to be credible. Without extensive documentary evidence to support the survivors' testimonies, some dismissed the story as exaggerated or distorted by trauma and the passage of time. This skepticism was particularly painful for the few remaining survivors, who found their lifelong burden of secret trauma being questioned by the very people they had hoped would finally vindicate their experiences. The final vindication of the Nazino Island survivors came through an unlikely combination of post-Soviet historical research and modern forensic science. In 1993, a joint expedition of Russian historians, archaeologists, and forensic experts traveled to the island to search for physical evidence that could corroborate the survivors' accounts. What they found exceeded even the most horrific testimonies that had been preserved. The forensic team, led by Dr. Viktor Yanovich of the Russian Academy of Sciences, discovered the remains of over 400 individuals scattered across the island. But it wasn't just the number of bodies that was shocking. It was the condition in which they were found. Many of the skeletons showed clear evidence of having been butchered while the individuals were still alive. Cut marks on bones indicated that flesh had been systematically removed from living victims. Fracture patterns suggested that limbs had been deliberately broken, possibly to prevent escape. Most disturbing of all, several skulls showed evidence of having been cracked open while the individuals were still alive, apparently to access the brain. Dr. Yanovich, a veteran forensic investigator who had worked on mass grave sites across the former Soviet Union, was shaken by what his team discovered. "I have investigated many atrocities," he later wrote, "but nothing prepared me for the systematic nature of the violence we found evidence of on Nazino Island." This was not desperate people committing isolated acts of cannibalism. This was organized predation on an industrial scale. The archaeological evidence supported the survivors' accounts in remarkable detail. The team found the remains of crude shelters in the locations where survivors had described cannibal camps. They discovered improvised tools that had been used for butchering human flesh. They even found evidence of the kitchen that survivors had described, an area where bones had been systematically processed and cooked. But perhaps most important of all, the forensic team was able to determine approximate dates of death for many of the victims. The evidence confirmed that most deaths had occurred within the first few weeks after the deportees were abandoned on the island, exactly as survivors had described. Carbon dating of artifacts found on the island confirmed that they dated to 1933, eliminating any possibility that the evidence related to some other tragedy. DNA analysis of bone fragments allowed researchers to determine the ages and genders of victims, revealing the systematic targeting of children and women that survivors had described. The scientific validation of the survivors' accounts had a profound impact on Russian society and the international community. For the first time, there was undeniable physical evidence of one of the most extreme atrocities committed during the Soviet era. Elena Kroglova, the librarian who had kept secret diaries about her experiences for 47 years, lived just long enough to see the forensic team's findings published. She died in 1994, but her family said that learning about the archaeological evidence had brought her the first peace she had experienced since 1933. For 60 years, she carried the burden of knowing that people wouldn't believe what she had experienced, her daughter later explained. When the archaeologists confirmed that everything she remembered was true, it was like a weight had been lifted from her soul. The Nazino Island findings sparked broader investigations into the Soviet deportation campaigns of the 1930s. Historians began to piece together the full scope of these operations, revealing that hundreds of thousands of people had been subjected to similar treatment across the Soviet Union. Documents that had been hidden in classified archives for decades were finally released, showing that the Nazino tragedy was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic policy of disposing of undesirable populations. Other islands and remote locations had been used as dumping grounds for deportees, though none had resulted in the same level of documented cannibalism and extreme violence. International scholars and human rights organizations began to take notice of the Nazino Island case. The story was featured in academic conferences, documentary films, and museum exhibitions about Soviet-era atrocities. It became a powerful symbol of the dehumanizing potential of totalitarian systems. However, the full recognition of the Nazino tragedy was complicated by the political dynamics of post-Soviet Russia. During the 1990s, Russian society was struggling to come to terms with its Soviet past, while also dealing with economic collapse and social upheaval. Many Russians were exhausted by constant revelations about historical atrocities and wanted to focus on building a better future rather than dwelling on past horrors. Some Russian politicians and intellectuals also resisted international attention to Soviet-era crimes, viewing it as an attempt to undermine Russian national dignity. They argued that focusing on tragedies like Nazino Island played into Western propaganda efforts to discredit Russia's historical role in defeating fascism and building a modern industrial society. This political resistance meant that the Nazino Island story received more attention in Western media and academic circles than it did within Russia itself. International documentaries and books about the tragedy reached larger audiences than Russian-language publications, creating a strange situation where a Russian historical tragedy was better known abroad than in its country of origin. The few remaining survivors and their families found this situation particularly frustrating. They had spent decades in silence, and when the truth finally emerged, it seemed that their own society was reluctant to fully acknowledge what they had endured. Maria Tretyakova, who had been arrested in Moscow at the age of 23 and survived the ordeal on Nazino Island, lived until 1998. In one of her final interviews, she expressed mixed feelings about the attention the story was finally receiving. "I'm grateful that people finally know what happened to us. But I'm also sad that it took so long, and that most of us died before anyone cared enough to listen. We weren't asking for revenge or compensation. We just wanted people to know that we existed, that we suffered, and that it should never happen again." The Memorial Society, a Russian human rights organization dedicated to preserving the memory of Soviet-era victims, took up the cause of commemorating the Nazino Island tragedy. They organized annual memorial services, created educational materials about the deportation campaigns, and advocated for official recognition of the victims. However, their efforts faced increasing resistance as Vladimir Putin's government began to promote a more nationalist interpretation of Soviet history. The Kremlin's emphasis on the USSR's victory in World War II and its achievements in industrialization left little room for acknowledging the darker aspects of the Soviet past. In 2009, a small memorial plaque was installed on Nazino Island through the efforts of local historians and families of victims. The inscription, in both Russian and English, reads simply, "In memory of the thousands who died here in 1933. They were abandoned by the state, but not forgotten by history." The memorial ceremony was attended by fewer than 50 people, including 2 elderly children of survivors and several historians. No government officials were present, and the installation received minimal media coverage within Russia. Dr. Svetlana Dolgoruki, whose archival research had played a crucial role in bringing the story to light, continued her work documenting Soviet deportation campaigns until her retirement. She estimated that complete records of these operations would never be recovered, as too much evidence had been systematically destroyed. Nazino Island is important, not just because of the specific horror that occurred there, she explained in a 2010 interview, but because it represents the logical endpoint of treating human beings as disposable units in a grand social experiment. When the state decides that some people are expendable, this is where that logic leads. The broader lessons of the Nazino Island tragedy continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about human rights, state power, and the treatment of marginalized populations. Human rights advocates have pointed to the case as an example of how quickly civilized societies can descend into barbarism when institutional safeguards are removed and vulnerable populations are dehumanized. The story has been studied by psychologists interested in understanding how extreme circumstances can transform human behavior. The progression from individual desperation to organized predation on Nazino Island provides disturbing insights into the breakdown of social norms under stress. Historians have used the case to illustrate the dangers of ideological extremism and the importance of preserving institutional checks on state power. The bureaucratic processes that led to the Nazino deportation, the quotas, the compartmentalization of information, the dehumanizing language used to describe victims, demonstrate how systematic atrocities can emerge from seemingly rational administrative procedures. As we reflect on this tragedy today, nearly 90 years after it occurred, the lessons of Nazino Island remain urgently relevant. In a world where millions of people are still displaced by conflict, persecution, and state policies, the story serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when human beings are reduced to numbers on bureaucratic reports. The victims of Nazino Island deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in the ledger of Soviet crimes, but as individuals who faced unimaginable circumstances with varying degrees of courage, desperation, and humanity. Their story is a testament to both the depths of human evil and the persistence of human dignity in the face of absolute dehumanization. Today, Nazino Island sits quietly in the Ob River, its marshy ground covered with scrub brush and wild flowers. To a casual observer, it appears to be nothing more than an unremarkable piece of Siberian wilderness. The wind whispers through the reeds where once human screams echoed across the water. The soil that was once soaked with blood now nurtures new growth. But beneath the peaceful surface lies one of history's most haunting reminders of humanity's capacity for both evil and endurance. The small memorial plaque installed in 2009 has weathered the harsh Siberian winters, its inscription still legible to the rare visitors who make the difficult journey to this remote location. Occasionally, historians, journalists, or descendants of survivors make the pilgrimage to pay their respects to the thousands who died there. In recent years, climate change has begun to alter the island's landscape. Rising water levels have eroded parts of the shore, and some fear that evidence of the tragedy may be gradually disappearing beneath the waters of the Ob. This physical erasure mirrors the ongoing challenge of preserving the memory of events that powerful interests would prefer to forget. The story of Nazino Island continues to be told in classrooms, documentaries, and books around the world, but it remains largely unknown to the general public. It exists in that shadowy realm of historical knowledge reserved for specialists and those specifically seeking to understand the extremes of human experience. This obscurity is perhaps inevitable. The story of Nazino Island is so horrific that many people instinctively turn away from it. It challenges comfortable assumptions about civilization, progress, and the fundamental nature of human beings. It forces us to confront the reality that the veneer of civility that separates us from barbarism may be far thinner than we would like to believe. Yet this is precisely why the story must be told and retold. The victims of Nazino Island were not monsters or criminals deserving of their fate. They were ordinary people workers, students, parents, children, who were caught in the machinery of a state that had decided they were expendable. Their transformation from citizens into deportees, into victims, into cannibals happened through a series of deliberate policy decisions made by officials who never had to witness the consequences of their actions. The bureaucrats who signed the deportation orders returned home each night to comfortable apartments and family dinners, never imagining that their administrative efficiency was creating hell on earth. This disconnect between bureaucratic decision-making and human consequences is not unique to the Soviet system. It exists in every society where people are reduced to statistics, where policy is made without consideration for individual human dignity, where undesirable elements are seen as problems to be solved rather than people to be helped. The survivors of Nazino Island, who lived long enough to see their story acknowledged, often expressed a simple wish that their experiences would serve as a warning to future generations. They hoped that by bearing witness to what they had endured, they could help prevent similar tragedies from occurring again. Whether that hope has been fulfilled remains an open question. In the decades since the Nazino Island story emerged from secrecy, the world has witnessed genocides in Rwanda, Bosnia, and Myanmar. Millions of refugees continue to face abandonment and indifference from the international community. Authoritarian governments still use deportation and forced relocation as tools of social control. The specific circumstances that created the Nazino tragedy, the ideological extremism, the bureaucratic incompetence, the systematic dehumanization of targeted populations, continue to exist in various forms around the world. The potential for similar horrors remains as long as societies fail to learn from the lessons of history. But the story of Nazino Island also offers more hopeful lessons about human resilience and the power of truth to eventually overcome even the most systematic efforts at suppression. The survivors who maintained their silence for decades, who carried unbearable secrets through long lives of quiet desperation, ultimately succeeded in ensuring that their experiences would not be forgotten entirely. Dr. Grigorieva, who died in the Gulag for trying to document what she had witnessed, could not have imagined that her observations would eventually contribute to a scientific understanding of the tragedy. The survivors who whispered their stories to their children and grandchildren, despite the risks, created an underground river of memory that eventually surfaced when the political climate allowed. The archivists and historians who refused to accept official denials, who searched through dusty files and interviewed traumatized witnesses, demonstrated the vital importance of preserving difficult truths, even when society is not ready to hear them. In the end, the most fitting memorial to victims of Nazino Island may be the simple act of remembering, of refusing to let their suffering disappear into the convenient amnesia that often surrounds historical atrocities. Every time their story is told, every time someone learns about what happened on that remote Siberian island in 1933, the victims achieve a small victory over the forces that tried to erase them from history. The wind still blows across Nazino Island, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the sound of lapping water. But for those who know its history, it also carries something else, the voices of the forgotten, demanding that their story be remembered, their suffering acknowledged, and the lessons of their tragedy never lost to the passage of time. In remembering them, we honor not only their memory, but our own humanity. We acknowledge that each individual life has value, that suffering matters, and that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against those who would treat human beings as expendable. The horror of Nazino Island must never be forgotten. The humanity of its victims must never be denied, and the warning embedded in their story must never be ignored. This is why we remember. This is why we tell these dark stories from history's shadows. This is why the forgotten horrors must never truly be forgotten. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey through one of history's darkest chapters. The story of Nazino Island reminds us that the capacity for both great evil and great resilience exists within humanity, and that our responsibility is to remember those who suffered so that such horrors are never repeated. If this story has moved you, please take a moment to reflect on its lessons and share it with others who need to hear these important truths from our past. The victims of Nazino Island deserve to be remembered, and their story deserves to be told.